A child brought a drawing to the millionaire at the hospital, and what he saw changed his life. The sharp beeping of a heart monitor echoed through the spotless hallways of St. Luke's Hospital, breaking the heavy silence surrounding the presidential suite. There, lying in a king-size bed that looked more suited to a luxury hotel than a medical facility, was Edward Marks, the man Forbes magazine had recently crowned as the most ruthless real estate tycoon. Edward stared blankly at the ceiling, his expression as cold as the steel walls of the skyscrapers he'd built. At 62, he was the embodiment of material success and existential emptiness. The room around him was a testament to his wealth. Original artwork adorned the walls, an untouched minibar stocked with the world's rarest spirits stood nearby, and beyond the suite's 20th floor windows stretched a panoramic view of the city he practically owned. But none of it mattered now. "Mr. Marks," the calm voice of Dr. Walker broke the silence like a knife. "We need to discuss your test results." Edward turned his head slowly toward the doctor, his face a mask of indifference. "How long?" was all he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. Dr. Walker hesitated, her eyes showing a compassion Edward despised. "It's complicated, Mr. Marks. Your condition is rare, and the prognosis is uncertain. We might be looking at months, maybe a year with the right treatment." A bitter smile crossed Edward's lips. "A year," he murmured. "Funny how time suddenly becomes precious when it's running out. Isn't it, Doctor?" Before she could respond, the door opened and a young nurse entered, carrying a tray of medications. Her brown eyes met Edward's for a moment, and he felt something strange, a spark of, recognition. Impossible. "This is Sophia, Mr. Marks," Dr. Walker introduced. "She'll be your primary nurse during your stay here." Sophia approached the bed, her face a mix of professionalism and something else Edward couldn't quite place. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Marks," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Edward observed her intensely, an uncomfortable feeling settling in his stomach. There was something about her. "Have we met before?" he asked abruptly. A flicker of emotion crossed Sophia's face, so brief that Edward almost missed it. "No, sir," she replied, busying herself with the medications. "I think I'd remember," Edward frowned, not entirely convinced. As Sophia prepared his medication, he noticed a small, colorful drawing peeking out of her pocket. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. Sophia glanced down, a genuine smile lighting up her face for the first time. "Oh, it's a drawing my son made. He loves to draw." "Your son?" Edward asked, feeling a sudden unfamiliar pang in his chest. "How old is he?" 7, Sophia answered, a hint of pride in her voice. "He's quite talented for his age." Edward fell silent for a moment, memories he'd long buried threatening to resurface. He pushed them back ruthlessly. "Well," he said coldly, "I hope you keep your personal life out of this room, Nurse Sophia. I'm here for treatment, not companionship." Sophia's smile faltered, but she maintained her professional composure. "Of course, Mr. Marks. I apologize." As Sophia finished administering the medication, Edward couldn't help but notice how her hands trembled slightly. There was a story there, he was sure, and despite his own declaration, he found himself intrigued. Dr. Walker cleared her throat, drawing his attention back to her. "Mr. Marks, there are some important decisions we need to make regarding your treatment. Given the advanced stage of your illness, we may need to consider experimental options." Edward waved a dismissive hand. "Do whatever is necessary, Doctor. Money is no issue. Just keep me alive." The doctor nodded, exchanging a meaningful look with Sophia. "Very well. We'll begin right away. Sophia, please prepare Mr. Marks for his first round of tests." As the two women moved around the room, preparing equipment and adjusting monitors, Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a lifetime of decisions pressing down on him. Why was it only now, when he was about to lose everything, that he started questioning the value of what he'd built? The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway caught his attention. Opening his eyes, Edward saw a man in a suit enter the room, looking agitated. "Mr. Marks," the man panted, "I apologize for disturbing you, but there's an urgent situation at the company that requires your immediate attention." Edward sighed. the familiarity of the business world offering a strange comfort. "What is it this time, Richard?" As Richard began detailing the latest crisis, Edward felt Sophia's gaze on him. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Edward had the unsettling feeling that she could see through his carefully constructed facade, straight to the hollow core he'd spent a lifetime denying. The heart monitor beeped slightly faster, a constant reminder of the battle he was about to face, not only against the illness consuming his body, but against the demons that had long inhabited his soul. And so, as the sun set over the city Edward Marks had built, the stage was set for a journey no one in that room could have predicted, a journey that would begin with a simple drawing and end by redefining the meaning of a life. The morning light tinged Edward's room with golden hues, but the tycoon barely noticed. His night had been a whirlwind of nightmares and phantom pains. Now, sitting in the Italian leather armchair by the window, he watched the city awaken, feeling strangely disconnected from the empire he'd built. A soft knock at the door announced Sophia's arrival. "Good morning, Mr. Marks," she said, entering with a breakfast tray that rivaled any five-star hotel. "How are you feeling today?" Edward grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the cup of coffee she extended to him. As he took the cup, his fingers brushed hers for an instant, and he felt an inexplicable shiver run down his spine. "Your tests are scheduled for 10 a.m., Sophia informed him, checking the monitors with professional efficiency. "Doctor, Victor will be here to—" A sudden noise in the hallway interrupted her. It sounded like something or someone had fallen, followed by a muffled, "Oops!" Sophia froze, a look of panic crossing her face. "Excuse me, Mr. Marks," she murmured, hurrying to the door. Intrigued despite himself, Edward leaned forward, trying to catch snippets of the whispered conversation in the hallway. "Miguel, what are you doing here?" Sophia's voice was a mix of surprise and concern. "Surprise, Mommy," a child's voice replied cheerfully. "I came to help you take care of the sick people." Edward frowned. Miguel, Sophia's son? What was a child doing in his private wing? Before he could fully process, the door opened again. Sophia entered, her face wearing an expression of professional apologies, followed by a little boy with curly hair and bright eyes. "Mr. Marks, I'm terribly sorry for the interruption," Sophia began, but Miguel interrupted, running forward. "Hi, I'm Miguel," the boy announced, grinning broadly at Edward. "Are you the important man my mum is taking care of?" Edward stared at the child, momentarily speechless. There was something about Miguel's pure, innocent energy that left him unsettled. "Miguel," Sophia said firmly, "we shouldn't disturb Mr. Marks. Let's go. You need to go home with Aunt—" "Wait," Edward found himself saying, surprising even himself. "Let him stay for a moment." Sophia hesitated, clearly torn between following professional protocol and obeying her patient's direct order. Taking the opportunity, Miguel walked up to Edward's chair. "Do you like to draw?" he asked, pulling a crumpled sketchbook from his backpack. "I love drawing." Edward looked at the sketchbook, then back at the eager face of Miguel. "I used to draw," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "A long time ago." Miguel's eyes lit up. "Want to see my drawings?" Before Edward could respond, Miguel was already flipping through the pages, showing him colorful pictures, imaginary landscapes, fantastic animals, and smiling figures who, Edward assumed, were family and friends. "This one," Miguel said, stopping on a particularly colorful page, "is my favorite. It's a magical place where everyone is happy and no one gets sick." Edward studied the drawing, feeling something strange stir in his chest. It was a scene of a park, with people of all ages smiling and playing together. In the center was a tall figure holding a child's hand, surrounded by a golden glow. "Who are they?" Edward asked, pointing to the central figures. Miguel smiled mysteriously. "That's a secret," he whispered. "But if you want, you can keep the drawing. Maybe it'll help you get better." Before Edward could protest, Miguel tore the page out of his sketchbook and placed it in Edward's lap. "Miguel," Sophia exclaimed, finally stepping in. "We can't give away our drawings without asking first." Edward looked down at the drawing in his lap, then back at Miguel's hopeful face. For a moment, he saw himself reflected in the child's eyes, not the cold, calculated magnate he'd become, but the boy who once dreamed of creating beauty in the world. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'd like to keep it, if you don't mind." Miguel's smile could have lit up the entire city. "Great. I hope it makes you smile when you're feeling sad." Sophia, relieved that the situation hadn't spiraled, gently guided Miguel toward the door. "Come on, sweetie. We need to let Mr. Marks rest now." As they left, Miguel turned back one last time. "Bye, Mr. Important. I hope you get better soon." The door closed, leaving Edward alone with the colorful drawing in his lap. He studied it for a long moment, his fingers tracing the joyful lines and vibrant colors. Why was a simple piece of paper affecting him so deeply? It was just a child's drawing, yet somehow... Edward carefully folded the paper and placed it on his bedside table. As he prepared for the day's tests, his eyes kept returning to the drawing, as if it were some sort of mysterious talisman. He didn't know it then, but that simple act of kindness from a child would be the first piece of a puzzle that would change the course of his life forever. The monotone hum of the machines filled Edward's room, a mechanical symphony marking the passage of time. 3 days had passed since Miguel's unexpected visit, and the colorful drawing remained untouched on the bedside table, nearly forgotten amidst the hectic routine of tests and treatments. Edward sat on his bed, his laptop open in front of him, his eyes focused on the screen displaying financial graphs and reports. Even confined to the hospital, he refused to let go of the reins of his empire. "Mr. Marks," Dr. Victor's voice interrupted his concentration. "We need to discuss the results of your recent tests." Edward looked up, noticing for the first time that the doctor was in the room. Beside him, Sophia was preparing another dose of medication, her face a mask of professionalism. "Go ahead, doctor," Edward said, snapping his laptop shut with a decisive click. "Doctor?" Victor cleared his throat, exchanging a quick look with Sophia. "The results are not what we'd hoped. The illness is progressing faster than we initially anticipated." Edward felt a tightness in his chest, but his expression remained impassive. "How much time?" "It's hard to say for certain, but..." Dr. Victor hesitated. "Perhaps 6 months at most." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitors. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the news. When he opened them, his gaze was steel. "All right," he said coolly. "What are our options?" As Dr. Victor outlined possible experimental treatments, Edward noticed Sophia moving quietly around the room. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw something in hers, compassion, pity, that irritated him deeply. "Nurse," he interrupted her brusquely. "Bring me the phone. I need to make some calls." Sophia nodded, handing him the phone without a word. As she stepped away, Edward saw her glance at the forgotten drawing on the bedside table. For a moment, a look of sadness crossed her face, so fleeting he almost missed it. Ignoring the unsettling feeling in his stomach, Edward turned his attention to his calls. There was much to be done, decisions to be made. He had no time for childish drawings or foolish sentiment. Hours passed in a haze of phone calls, emails, and tense discussions with his legal team. As the night fell, Edward felt the weight of his mortality more than ever. That's when he heard it. Voices muffled outside his room, urgent whispers that seemed loaded with secrets. "Are you sure about this?" It was Dr. Victor's voice, tense and worried. "Absolutely," replied another voice Edward recognized as Richard, his right-hand man at the company. "He can't know. Not yet." Edward leaned forward, straining to hear more. What were they talking about? What were they hiding from him? The door opened abruptly, and Edward quickly leaned back, pretending to be absorbed in his laptop. Richard entered, his face wearing a mask of professional concern. "Mr. Marks," he began, "we have a situation at the company that requires your attention." Edward narrowed his eyes, studying Richard's face. Something was off, an underlying tension that didn't match his outward composure. "What kind of situation, Richard?" he asked calmly, his mind racing to connect the dots. As Richard began detailing an alleged crisis with one of Edward's real estate projects, the magnate felt the first whispers of suspicion forming in his mind. Something bigger was happening, something beyond his illness and the company's affairs. His gaze wandered around the room, briefly resting on Miguel's drawing. For an instant, the colorful, cheerful scene seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of the innocence and trust he had long since lost. Edward pushed the thought away, turning his attention back to Richard. If there was a conspiracy brewing, he would uncover it. After all, he hadn't reached the top by being naive or overly trusting. "Richard," he cut off the other man's monologue, "I want a complete audit of all ongoing projects, immediately." Richard visibly paled. "But, sir, with your current condition." "My condition," Edward said icily, "is precisely why we need to ensure everything is in order." "Understood." Richard nodded stiffly, tension visible in his shoulders. "Of course, Mr. Marks. I'll get on it right away." When Richard left, Edward found himself alone once again. The silence of the room broken only by the steady beep of the machines. His eyes drifted once more to Miguel's drawing, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine the simple, happy world the child had depicted, but reality was far different. As the night wore on, Edward Marks made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost, and if anyone was scheming against him, they would learn why he was feared in the business world. The drawing remained on the bedside table, ignored but not forgotten, a window into a world of possibilities Edward was not yet ready to explore. Dawn found Edward Marks still awake, his eyes red as he stared at his laptop screen. The hours spent scrutinizing every detail of his business had revealed nothing concrete, only fueled his paranoia. The room, once a symbol of his power and wealth, now felt stifling. A sudden fit of coughing shook him, a harsh reminder of his physical fragility. When he finally calmed down, his gaze fell on Miguel's drawing, still untouched on the bedside table. Hesitating, Edward reached out and picked up the paper. The vibrant colors seemed out of place in the sterile environment, like a defiant flower growing through concrete. "A magical place where everyone is happy and no one gets sick," he murmured, recalling Miguel's words. As he studied the drawing, Edward felt something strange, a mix of nostalgia and regret that he hadn't felt in years. His eyes fixed on the central figure, the tall man holding hands with a child. Suddenly, a long-buried memory surfaced. Edward, only 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, drawing furiously. His father, a stern man rarely seen without a suit, looked over his shoulder. "What's this?" his father asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. "It's our family," young Edward replied proudly. "Look, Dad, this is you taking me to the park." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, his father spoke. "Edward, businessmen don't waste time on drawings. It's time to grow up and focus on what really matters." With a heavy sigh, Edward returned to the present. When was the last time he had drawn anything? When was the last time he'd done something purely for the joy of creating? His eyes roamed the hospital room, stopping on each symbol of his wealth and power, the gold watch on the bedside table, the Armani suit hanging in the closet, the latest smartphone next to his laptop, all trophies from a life dedicated to what really matters. And for what? To be here alone, sick and suspicious of everyone around him? A movement in the hallway caught his attention. Through the slightly open door, he saw Sophia arriving for her shift, carrying a brightly colored backpack that obviously belonged to Miguel. She paused for a moment, took a small object from the bag, a folded drawing, and tucked it into her uniform pocket, a soft smile on her lips. Edward felt a pang of envy. The nurse clearly didn't have a fraction of his wealth, but that simple gesture conveyed a happiness that seemed strangely out of his reach. Looking back at Miguel's drawing in his hands, Edward allowed himself, for the first time in decades, to wonder. What if? What if he'd made different choices? What if he'd valued things other than power and money? A bitter laugh escaped his lips. How absurd. He was Edward Marks, the business shark. There was no room in his life for what if or regrets. Yet, his fingers traced the lines of the drawing, stopping at the figure of the child. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine that it was him, holding hands with a loving father, in a world where illness and betrayal didn't exist. The sound of the door opening brought him back to reality. Sophia entered, carrying a tray with his morning medications. "Good morning, Mr. Marks," she said softly. "How are you feeling today?" Edward opened his mouth to give his usual response, a mix of indifference and irritation, but stopped. Instead, he found himself saying, "Have you ever wondered, Sophia, if you made the right choices in life?" The nurse paused, clearly surprised by the unexpected question. Her eyes fell on the drawing in Edward's hands, and a knowing smile touched her lips. "Every day, Mr. Marks," she replied honestly. "But then I remember that every choice brought me to where I am today. And there's always time for new choices, isn't there?" Edward looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. There was a wisdom in her words that took him off guard. "Maybe," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Sophia nodded, respecting his moment of reflection as she prepared his medication. When she finished, she hesitated for a moment before saying, "You know, Mr. Marks, Miguel asked about you. He hopes the drawing is helping." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. "Tell him," he began, then paused, unsure of what he wanted to say. Sophia waited patiently, her face a mask of gentle understanding. Finally, Edward said, "Tell him I'm grateful." Sophia's smile lit up her entire face. "I will, sir. Have a good day." When she left, Edward found himself looking at the drawing again. For the first time in years, he felt an intense desire to create something, to leave a mark on the world measured not in dollars or cents. Picking up a pencil and a piece of paper from his bedside table, Edward Marks began to draw. He didn't know what it meant or where it would lead him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something he'd forgotten long ago. Hope. The pencil danced across the paper, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. Edward Marks, the feared business magnate, was completely absorbed in something he hadn't done in decades: drawing. Hours passed unnoticed as he sketched, erased and redrew. When he finally leaned back, exhausted but strangely satisfied, the sun was already high in the sky. He looked at his work with a mix of pride and shame. It was nothing compared to Miguel's vibrant drawing, but it was honest. The paper showed a solitary man in an empty office, surrounded by skyscrapers. It was him, Edward realized, as he truly saw himself. A soft knock on the door broke him from his thoughts. Sophia entered, carrying a tray with his lunch. "Mr. Marks, She stopped, noticing the drawing in his hands. "Did you draw this?" Edward felt a wave of embarrassment. "It's just a silly scribble," he murmured, trying to hide the paper. Sophia approached, her eyes shining with genuine interest. "May I see?" Reluctantly, Edward handed her the drawing. Sophia studied it for a long moment, her face a mixture of emotions Edward couldn't decipher. "It's not silly," she finally said, her voice soft. "It's powerful, sad, but full of potential." Edward stared at her, surprised. "Potential?" Sophia nodded, pointing to the window in the drawing. "See how you drew this window? It's open. There's a world outside waiting if you choose to explore it." Sophia's words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He had never thought of it that way. "Miguel would be so happy to know your drawing," Sophia said, handing the paper back. The mention of the boy's name made Edward remember the original drawing. He picked it up from the bedside table, comparing the two side by side. "They're so different," he murmured. Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, momentarily forgetting her professional stance. "Different, yes, but both are true. One shows the world as it could be, the other as it is now. The question is, which one do you want to make your reality?" Edward looked at Sophia, truly seeing her for the first time. "You're more than just a nurse, aren't you?" An enigmatic smile played on her lips. "We're all more than we seem, Mr. Marks. Even you." Before Edward could respond, a noise in the hallway caught his attention. The door opened suddenly, and Miguel ran in, his face lit up with a smile. "Mom, He stopped, seeing Edward. "Oh, hi, Mr. Important?" Sophia quickly got up. "Miguel, what are you doing here?" "Auntie had to leave, so she brought me here," Miguel explained, his eyes fixed on the drawings in Edward's hands. "Are you drawing?" Edward hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I tried." Miguel's face lit up even more. "Can I see?" Before Edward could answer, Miguel was already beside the bed, eagerly looking at the drawings. His eyes moved from the colorful one to Edward's somber sketch. "Wow," he said quietly. "Is that you?" Edward nodded, feeling strangely vulnerable. Miguel studied the drawing for a moment, then looked up at Edward with a surprising seriousness for someone so young. "You look sad here. You're alone." The child's simple words hit Edward like a lightning bolt. That was exactly how he felt, wasn't it? Alone even at the top of his empire. "But you know what?" Miguel continued, his face brightening. "You don't have to be alone. Look," he pointed to the colorful drawing. "There are lots of people here. You could be here too." Edward looked at the vibrant drawing, then back at his own dark sketch. The difference was striking. "It's not that simple, Miguel," he began, but the boy interrupted him. "Why not? It's just a drawing. You can do whatever you want in it." Miguel's childlike logic was so simple, so pure, that Edward found himself without words. Sophia, who had been watching the interaction in silence, finally spoke up. "Miguel's right, Mr. Marks. Sometimes we have to let ourselves imagine a different future before we can create it." Edward looked at the two of them, feeling something break inside him. Years of carefully constructed defenses began to crack. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Miguel smiled, grabbing a colored pencil. "I can show you. We can draw together." Before Edward could protest, Miguel was already climbing onto the bed, spreading colored pencils everywhere. Sophia started to intervene, but Edward stopped her with a gesture. "It's all right," he said, surprising even himself. I'd like to learn." And so, on that sunny afternoon, the powerful Edward Marks found himself drawing with a child, adding color to his monochromatic world. Each stroke seemed to erase a bit of the coldness he'd cultivated for so many years. When Sophia finally took Miguel home, promising to return the next day, Edward was left looking at their drawings. The contrast between them was clear, but now there were bridges between the two worlds, small touches of color in his once somber sketch, realistic details in Miguel's fantasy world. For the first time in years, Edward Marks fell asleep with a smile on his face, dreaming of a world full of possibilities he was only beginning to explore. Dawn found Edward restless, his eyes fixed on the drawings on the bedside table. His drawing session with Miguel the previous day had stirred something within him, a mix of nostalgia and hope he didn't know how to process. A movement in the hallway caught his attention. Through the slightly open door, he saw Sophia arriving for her shift. But something was wrong. Her usually calm face was tense, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. When she entered the room, Edward noticed her hands trembling slightly as she prepared his medication. "Sophia," he called out, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "Is everything all right?" She turned, clearly surprised by the question. For a moment, she seemed about to deny it, but then her shoulders slumped. "No, Mr. Marks," she admitted. "It's not." Edward found himself in unfamiliar territory. Normally, he wouldn't care about an employee's personal problems. But something, perhaps the vulnerability in her eyes, so similar to what he'd seen in his own reflection recently, made him ask, "Would you like to talk about it?" Sophia hesitated, then nodded slowly. She sat in the chair next to his bed, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. "It's about my father," she began. He's very sick. The treatment is expensive and I..." Her voice faltered. Edward felt a pang of guilt. How many times had he raised the prices of his real estate ventures without thinking about the Sophias of the world, struggling to make ends meet? "I'm sorry," he said, surprised to find he truly meant it. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The words left his mouth before he could think, and for a moment he saw a flicker of hope in Sophia's eyes. But then, something changed. Her expression closed, a mask of determination replacing her vulnerability. "No, Mr. Marks," she said firmly. "I appreciate it, but it wouldn't be appropriate." Edward frowned, intrigued by her sudden change in attitude. "Sophia, But before he could continue, the door burst open. Richard entered, his face wearing a mask of professional concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Marks," he began, then stopped when he saw Sophia. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." Edward noticed the exchange of glances between Richard and Sophia, quick but loaded with meaning. "It's all right, Richard," Edward said, his mind working furiously. "Sophia was just leaving. What do you have for me?" As Richard began to report on the latest business developments, Edward watched Sophia leave the room silently. There was something there, a piece of the puzzle he couldn't quite place. "And the investors are getting nervous about your prolonged absence," Richard concluded. "They're asking for a board meeting to discuss succession." The words hit Edward like a bucket of cold water. "Succession," he growled. "I'm not dead yet, Richard." Richard raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Of course not, sir. It's just a precaution given the recent developments." Edward narrowed his eyes. What developments? For a moment, he saw a flicker of something. Fear, guilt, in Richard's eyes. But it passed so quickly, he might have imagined it. "Just concerns about your health, sir," Richard said smoothly. "Rumors spread quickly, you know." Edward nodded slowly, his mind racing. There was more to this story than Richard was letting on. "Fine," he said finally. "Schedule the meeting. I'll attend via video conference." Richard looked surprised. "Are you sure, sir, with your condition—" "My condition," Edward interrupted coldly, "is none of your concern. Schedule the meeting." After Richard left, Edward was left alone with his turbulent thoughts. The conversation with Sophia, Richard's reaction, the whispers about succession, it all seemed connected in a way he couldn't yet see clearly. His eyes fell on the drawings on the bedside table. Miguel's colorful, happy world seemed to mock him now, a cruel reminder of the innocence he'd lost long ago. But then, something caught his attention. In the corner of Miguel's drawing, almost hidden among the vibrant colors, was a small symbol. Edward frowned, leaning closer to get a better look. It was a logo. One he knew well, the logo of one of his former subsidiaries, a company he'd shut down years ago in a particularly ruthless deal. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Sophia's sick father, her reluctance to accept help, the glance she exchanged with Richard. "My God," Edward murmured, feeling the weight of realization settle over him. Sophia wasn't just some random nurse. She had a connection to his past, one that could explain much of what was happening. At that moment, as if summoned by his thoughts, Sophia reappeared at the door. Her face was composed again, but there was a determination in her eyes Edward hadn't noticed before. "Mr. Marks," she said, her voice firm. "I think we need to talk." Edward nodded slowly, feeling as though he were on the brink of a revelation that would change everything. "Yes, Sophia," he said. "I believe we do." As Sophia stepped inside and closed the door behind her, Edward felt the world around him shift. The conspiracies, the secrets, his past and his future, all were about to collide. And at the center of it all was a simple child's drawing, an innocent reminder of a world Edward had long forgotten, a world of colors, connections, and second chances. The silence in the room was palpable as Edward and Sophia faced each other. The tension in the air was almost electric, charged with secrets waiting to be revealed. "So," Edward began, his voice calm but masking an internal storm, "you're not just a nurse, are you?" Sophia took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "No, Mr. Marks, I'm not." "You're the daughter of Charles Ferris," Edward said, not as a question but as a statement. The name left his lips heavy with decades of history and regret. Sophia nodded slowly. "Yes. The man whose life and business you destroyed 15 years ago." Her words hung between them, sharp as blades. Edward felt the familiar urge to defend himself, to justify his past actions. But something stopped him. Maybe it was Miguel's drawing, still visible in his peripheral vision, a silent reminder of innocence and possibility. "Why are you here, Sophia?" he finally asked. "Revenge?" A sad smile touched her lips. "At first, yes. I wanted to see the man who ruined my family suffer. But then I met the man behind the monster," Sophia said quietly. "I saw you with Miguel. I saw how his drawing affected you. And I realized that maybe Maybe there was more to Edward Marks than the world knows. Edward felt something inside him break. Years of carefully built defenses crumbled in the face of Sophia's raw honesty. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I hurt many people. Your father. He was just a number to me back then. Another obstacle to remove." Sophia nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And now?" Edward looked at Miguel's drawing, then back at Sophia. "Now? Now, I don't even know who I am anymore. The man I was. He doesn't seem real anymore." A moment of understanding passed between them. Sophia reached out hesitantly, touching Edward's arm. The simple gesture, so full of compassion, almost undid him. "It's not too late to change," she said softly. Edward nodded slowly, then straightened, a new determination in his eyes. "You're right, and we can start now. Sophia, I need you to tell me everything you know about the conspiracy against me." Sophia's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I may be many things, but a fool isn't one of them," Edward said with a slight smile. "Something's going on here, something bigger than your personal revenge, and I think you know more than you're saying." Sophia hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. She told him about the whispered conversations she'd overheard between Richard and Dr. Victor's, about mysterious documents she'd seen exchanged, and about the late-night visits from strangers in suits to his hospital wing. As she spoke, Edward felt the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. The picture that emerged was disturbing, an elaborate scheme to take not only his company but his very life. "They're poisoning me," Edward concluded, the realization hitting him like a punch. "The treatment. It's not a treatment, is it?" Sophia shook her head, tears now streaming freely down her face. "No, I suspected, but I wasn't certain until recently. I'm so sorry, Mr. Marks. I should have said something sooner, but—" Edward raised a hand, stopping her. "You're telling me now, that's what matters." He got out of bed, feeling a strength he hadn't felt in weeks. The knowledge, however terrible, was empowering. "We need evidence," he said, his mind already working out a plan, "and we need to be careful. They can't know that we're onto them." Sophia nodded, wiping away her tears. "What do you need me to do?" Edward smiled, a flash of his old self shining through. "Do what you do best, Sophia. Watch, listen, and keep me informed." As they discussed the details of their plan, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. It wasn't just about saving himself now. It was about justice, redemption, and maybe a chance to right some of his past wrongs. His eyes fell once more on Miguel's drawing. The colorful, happy world the child had imagined felt more distant than ever, but also, somehow, more within reach. "One last thing, Sophia," Edward said as she was about to leave. "Are your father, how is he, really?" Sophia paused, surprised by the question. "Not well," she admitted. "The treatment is expensive, and with the company gone—" Edward nodded, a decision forming in his mind. "Send me the details, discreetly. I'll take care of it." Sophia's eyes widened. "Mr. Marks, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Edward interrupted gently. "It's a start, Sophia, a small step towards something better." After Sophia left, Edward found himself alone again, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel lonely. Picking up a pencil, he turned back to his unfinished drawing. Slowly, carefully, he began to add color. Morning arrived with a new determination for Edward Marks. The revelations of the previous day still echoed in his mind, mingling with the colors of Miguel's drawing, which now held a place of honor on his bedside table. While he awaited Sophia's arrival, Edward focused on his own drawing. What had begun as a bleak sketch of a lonely man in an empty office was now coming to life with small touches of color. Tiny changes, almost imperceptible at first glance, but they completely altered the tone of the image. The sound of footsteps in the hallway alerted him to Sophia's arrival. She entered, carrying not only the usual tray of medications, but also a thin folder. "Good morning, Mr. Marks," she said, her professional tone masking the shared secret they now held. "Sophia," Edward nodded, watching her closely. "Any news?" She glanced quickly at the closed door before replying, "Yes, I managed to get some information you'll want to see." While Sophia prepared the medications, now only harmless saline solutions, Edward examined the documents she'd brought. They were printed emails, fragmented conversations, and financial reports that, at first glance, seemed innocuous. But to Edward's trained eyes, they told a sinister story. "They've been planning this for months," he murmured, anger rising in his chest. "Richard, Dr. Victor, even members of the board are involved." Sophia nodded somberly. "It's worse than we imagined. They're not just after the company, Mr. Marks. They want to make sure you can't fight back." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. The reality of his situation hit him with full force. It wasn't just his fortune or company at stake. It was his life. "We need to act quickly," he said, his mind already formulating strategies. "But we have to be smart. They can't suspect we know." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted them. Edward quickly hid the documents while Sophia adopted a professional stance. "Come in," Edward called, his voice controlled. To his surprise, it wasn't Richard or Dr. Victor who entered, but a figure he hadn't seen in years, his ex-wife and Clara. "Edward," she said, her voice a mix of concern and determination, "we need to talk." The silence that followed was tense. Sophia looked from one to the other, clearly sensing the shared history between them. "It's all right, Sophia," Edward finally said. "You can give us a moment." Once Sophia left, Clara approached the bed, her eyes studying Edward critically. "You look terrible," she commented. Edward couldn't help a wry smile. "Always straight to the point, aren't you, Clara? What brings you here after all these years?" Clara sighed, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "I heard rumors, Edward. Worrying rumors about your health, about the company. I came to see for myself." Edward studied his ex-wife's face. Despite the years of separation and harsh words exchanged during their divorce, he could still read her expressions. There was genuine concern there, mixed with something else. Fear. "What do you really know, Clara?" he asked calmly. Clara hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I know there are people who want you out of the way, Edward. Powerful people. And they're willing to go to great lengths to make it happen." Edward felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger at the betrayal he faced, gratitude for Clara's concern, and a deep sadness for the time they'd lost. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "After everything that happened between us?" Clara met his gaze, sadness evident on her face. "Because, despite everything, Edward, part of me still cares about you. And because," she hesitated, "because I know not everything you did was out of malice. You just lost your way." Clara's words struck Edward like a punch to the gut. Memories flooded his mind. The early years of their marriage, full of love and hope. The birth of their son, James. And then, slowly, ambition corroding everything, turning him into a man Clara no longer recognized. "James," Edward whispered, the name of his estranged son feeling heavy on his tongue. "Have you heard from him?" Clara shook her head sadly. "Not since the accident. Edward, do you really believe that he—" "No," Edward interrupted, a sudden certainty filling him. "No, Clara, I think our son is alive." Clara's eyes widened in shock. "What? How can you know that?" Edward hesitated, weighing his options. Finally, he decided to trust Clara completely. He told her about the conspiracy, his suspicions, and the strange feeling that somehow James was involved. When he finished, Clara was pale but determined. "What do you intend to do?" Edward glanced at Miguel's drawing, then back at Clara. "I'm going to fight, not just for the company or my life, but for a chance to make things right. With James, with you, with everyone I've hurt along the way." Clara studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You've changed, Edward. There's something different about you." Edward smiled softly, picking up Miguel's drawing. "Let's just say I had a change of perspective recently." As he explained to Clara about Miguel and Sophia, about the drawing and his emotional journey over the past few days, Edward felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was as though, by sharing his story, he was finally accepting the transformation within himself. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Clara," he said finally. "I've hurt many people, including you and James. I can't change the past, but maybe I can do something better with whatever future I have left. Clara reached out, gently touching Edward's hand. It's not too late, Edward. It's never too late to do the right thing. At that moment, a soft knock on the door announced Sophia's return. She entered hesitantly, her eyes assessing the scene in front of her. It's all right, Sophia, Edward said. In fact, I think we've just gained a powerful ally in our fight. Clara stood up, extending a hand to Sophia. Clara Marks. And it looks like we have a lot of work ahead of us. As the two women began discussing strategies, Edward leaned back into his pillows, a new sense of purpose filling him. The path ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but for the first time in years, he wasn't facing his demons alone. With one last glance at Miguel's drawing, Edward made a silent promise. He wouldn't just survive this ordeal, he would emerge from it a better man, worthy of the colorful, hopeful world a child had imagined for him. The plan was in motion. In the days following his conversation with Clara, Edward, Sophia, and his ex-wife worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and strategizing. The hospital room, once a symbol of confinement, had transformed into a covert operations center. Edward felt his strength slowly returning. With the poison flushed from his system, his color was beginning to return, and his mind was sharper than ever. But with the physical recovery came a growing restlessness. He knew they couldn't keep up the charade for much longer. One sunny afternoon, everything changed. Edward was reviewing some documents when he heard a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, hurried footsteps, and then, unexpectedly, a child's sharp cry. Miguel. Without thinking twice, Edward leapt out of bed, yanking out the tubes and sensors. Ignoring the dizziness that hit him, he strode to the door and flung it open. The scene before him was chaotic. At the end of the hallway, he saw Sophia struggling with Richard, while Dr. Victor held Miguel, his hand covering the boy's mouth. "Let him go!" Edward roared, his voice echoing down the hallway. Everyone froze, staring at Edward in shock. It was the moment of distraction Sophia needed. With a swift move, she broke free from Richard and ran toward Dr. Victor and Miguel. "Stay back!" Dr. Victor shouted, pulling Miguel closer, "or the boy gets hurt." Edward felt a fury he hadn't experienced in years. But mingled with that rage was something else, a protective instinct he thought he'd lost long ago. "Victor," Edward said, his voice dangerously calm as he advanced slowly. "Think carefully about what you're doing. Threatening a child. Is this what you've become?" Dr. Victor hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between Edward and the elevators at the end of the hallway. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "We had no choice. The company, the things you did." "I know," Edward interrupted, continuing to approach. "Believe me, I know better than anyone the mistakes I've made. But this isn't the solution." As he spoke, Edward noticed Sophia moving quietly behind Dr. Victor. Their eyes met briefly, and he understood the plan without words. "Miguel," Edward called softly, catching the frightened boy's attention. "Do you remember the drawing you gave me? The happy, colorful world?" Miguel's eyes widened in recognition, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. "That's the world we should be living in," Edward continued, taking another step forward. "A place where people help each other, where no one has to hurt anyone else. That's what you believe in, right?" Miguel nodded slightly, and Edward saw Dr. Victor's grip on him loosen. "I want to live in that world, Miguel," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your drawing, it showed me there's still hope. That it's never too late to change." In that moment, Sophia acted. With a swift movement, she grabbed Dr. Victor from behind, forcing him to release Miguel. The boy immediately ran to Edward, who wrapped him in a protective embrace. Richard, who had been watching the scene in stunned silence, finally reacted. He moved toward Edward and Miguel, but Clara suddenly appeared, blocking his path. "It's over, Richard," she said firmly. "This ends now." The sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of the police, whom Clara had discreetly called minutes earlier. Edward held Miguel tightly, feeling the boy's small body trembling against his. "It's all right now," he murmured, surprised by the tenderness in his own voice. "You're safe," As the police swarmed the hospital, arresting Richard and Dr. Victor, Edward remained where he was, protecting Miguel. Sophia ran over to them, wrapping her son in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered to Edward, tears of relief in her eyes. Edward nodded, a wave of emotions he could barely understand washing over him. In that moment, holding Miguel and seeing the gratitude in Sophia's eyes, he understood the power of a simple gesture. A child's drawing had not only changed his life, but had possibly saved Miguel's as well. The hours that followed were a blur of police statements and medical checks. Edward insisted on staying with Miguel and Sophia, refusing to leave them alone even when doctors tried to examine him. It was only late in the evening, once the hospital had quieted down, that Edward allowed himself to process everything that had happened. Sitting in his bed, with Miguel asleep in a nearby chair and Sophia dozing beside her son, he picked up the drawing that had started his transformation. The vibrant colors seemed even brighter now, as if they'd taken on a life of their own. Edward traced his finger along the image of the tall man holding the child's hand, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine it could be him. Clara slipped quietly into the room, taking a seat beside Edward. "How are you?" she asked softly. Edward took a deep breath, considering the question. "Changed," he finally replied. "Forever changed." Clara smiled, a genuine smile Edward hadn't seen in years. "You know," she said, "when I first came here, I was prepared to face the old Edward, the cold, calculating man I knew, but the man I saw today, he reminded me of the Edward I fell in love with all those years ago." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "I don't know if I can be that man again, Clara. I've made so many mistakes, hurt so many people." "Maybe you don't have to be exactly that man," Clara interrupted gently. "Maybe you can be someone better, someone who's learned from his mistakes and is determined to make a difference." Edward looked at Miguel and Sophia, then back at the drawing in his hands. "Do you think it's possible to fix everything I've broken?" Clara placed her hand over his. "I think you've already started, and you're not alone in this journey." Just then, as if sensing he was being watched, Miguel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Edward instinctively stood up, tucking the blanket around the boy. When he returned to his bed, he noticed Clara watching him with a knowing smile. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied. "I was just thinking that maybe, just maybe, that colorful, happy world in the drawing isn't so impossible after all." Edward felt a genuine smile spread across his face. "Maybe not," he agreed. "Maybe it's time to start coloring outside the lines." And so, as the night wore on, Edward Marks allowed himself to dream of a different future. A future where the mistakes of the past could be righted, where second chances were possible, and where a simple child's drawing could change the world. The dawn brought a tense calm over the hospital. Edward, still recovering from the previous day's events, sat in his bed, watching Miguel and Sophia sleep peacefully. Clara had left to handle the press and legal matters that were sure to arise after Richard and Dr. Victor's arrest. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Before Edward could respond, the door opened slowly, revealing a face he hadn't seen in years, a face he thought he'd never see again. "James?" Edward whispered, barely believing his eyes. The man at the door, older, harder than Edward remembered, but unmistakably his son, took a hesitant step into the room. "Hello, Dad," James said, his voice a mixture of conflicting emotions. Edward felt his heart race. 1,000 questions flooded his mind, but all he could say was, "You're alive." James nodded slowly, closing the door behind him. His eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on Miguel and Sophia before returning to Edward. "Not because of you," he said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. The statement hit Edward like a punch to the gut. "James, I thought you were dead. The accident." "It wasn't an accident," James interrupted coldly. "It was staged. My only way out of a life I couldn't stand." Edward felt the weight of years of guilt and regret bearing down on him. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you fake your own death?" James walked closer, his gaze fixed on Edward. "Because the man you were, he would have destroyed anyone who got in his way, even his own son." The words cut deep. Memories of his relentless pursuit of success, of all the times he'd neglected his family in favor of his business, flooded Edward's mind. I'm sorry, Edward said, the words feeling inadequate in the face of his mistakes. James laughed without humor. Sorry. Years of absence, of coldness, of manipulation, and you think I'm sorry is enough? Edward closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his past actions. When he reopened them, his gaze fell on Miguel's drawing on the bedside table. Suddenly, a terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. James, he began slowly, were you behind all of this? The conspiracy, the poisoning, the silence that followed was deafening. James looked away, and in that moment, Edward had his answer. My God, Edward murmured, the realization hitting him like a freight train. It was you, this whole time. James turned back to face him, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and pain. I wanted you to feel it, Dad. I wanted you to experience helplessness, fear, the sensation of having everything taken away, just like I felt all those years. Edward felt a storm of emotions, shock, anger, sorrow, and a profound, overwhelming guilt. James, But before he could continue, a small movement caught his attention. Miguel was waking up, his sleepy eyes opening slowly. Mr. Edward, the boy called softly, rubbing his eyes. The tension in the room shifted instantly. James took a step back, clearly not expecting the presence of a child. Edward reached out to Miguel, his protective instinct overpowering everything else. It's all right, Miguel. This is my son, James. Miguel's eyes widened with interest. He looked back and forth between Edward and James, clearly noticing the resemblance. Do you like drawing too? Miguel asked innocently, looking up at James. The simple question seemed to catch James off guard. For a moment, his hardened expression softened, revealing a vulnerability that Edward hadn't seen since James was a boy. I used to like it, James replied hesitantly. Miguel smiled, completely unaware of the tension in the room. Mr. Edward is learning to draw again. Maybe you could draw together. Miguel's innocent comment seemed to break something inside James. He turned away abruptly, looking out the window. Sensing the change in the room, Edward gently asked Miguel to wake up his mother. As Sophia stirred, confused by the presence of the stranger, Edward stood up from his bed, approaching his son cautiously. James, he said softly, I know that nothing I say can erase what I did. But I need you to know, the man I was, the father who hurt you so much, he doesn't exist anymore. James turned back slowly, his eyes meeting Edward's. How can I believe that? How can I trust anything you say? Edward picked up Miguel's drawing, holding it out to James. Because this changed everything. A simple act of kindness from a child. It made me see the world in a way I'd forgotten was possible. James looked at the drawing, then back at Miguel, who was now watching them curiously from his mother's side. A child, James murmured. All my planning, all my revenge, and a child accomplished what I couldn't. Edward felt a flicker of hope. It's not too late, son. Not for either of us. We can try to fix this together. For a long moment, James said nothing, his gaze moving between the drawing, Miguel, and Edward. Finally, with a deep sigh, he spoke. I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. Edward nodded, accepting his son's words. I understand. But I'm willing to try if you are. Day by day, action by action, we can try to rebuild what we lost. In that moment, Sophia, who had been observing the scene silently, took a step forward. Mr. James, she said softly, I don't know the whole story between you and your father, but I've seen the change in him these past days. I've seen how he protected my son, how he's fighting to be a better person. James looked at Sophia, then at Miguel, who was smiling innocently. You really believe he's changed? He asked. Sophia nodded. I believe he's trying. And sometimes, trying is the first step toward real change. A contemplative silence fell over the room. Miguel, sensing the gravity of the moment, picked up his colored pencils and began to draw quietly. Finally, James spoke. I can't promise anything. I can't pretend the last years didn't happen. But He hesitated, looking at the drawing in his hands. Maybe we can try drawing a new beginning. Edward felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He extended his hand to his son, half expecting to be rejected. To his surprise and relief, James accepted the gesture, briefly gripping his father's hand. "It won't be easy," James warned. "I know," Edward replied, "but it's worth trying." At that moment, Miguel approached them, holding a new drawing. "Look," he said, proudly showing the paper. "I drew all of us together." The drawing showed simple figures representing everyone in the room, holding hands, surrounded by a colorful and lively world. Edward and James looked at the drawing, then at each other. In that simple act of creativity, they saw a glimpse of a possible future. A future of healing, forgiveness, and new possibilities. As the morning sun filled the room, Edward Marks realized that his journey of transformation was far from over. But with each small step, each act of kindness, each attempt to right past wrongs, he was moving closer to the colorful, hopeful world a simple drawing had shown him was possible. 6 months had passed since that tense morning in the hospital. Edward Marks's world had turned upside down in ways he could never have imagined. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Edward's office at the Marks Foundation, a non-profit organization he'd established using the resources of his former company. The walls, once decorated with expensive paintings and corporate awards, now displayed colorful drawings, some by Miguel, others by children benefiting from the foundation's programs. Edward sat at his desk, studying a report on the foundation's latest project, a therapy art program for children in hospitals. His eyes lingered on a particular photo, children smiling, holding their drawings, with Sophia at the center, her face beaming. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, already knowing who it was. James entered, carrying a folder and a look of determination. Over the past few months, father and son had worked side by side at the foundation, slowly rebuilding their relationship through a shared purpose. "Here are the numbers for the last quarter," James said, placing the folder on the desk. "I think you'll be pleased with what you see." Edward opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. A genuine smile spread across his face. "This is incredible," he murmured. "We've helped more families than we expected." James nodded, pride evident in his voice. "The medical assistance program is making a real difference, and the best part is that we're only getting started." Edward looked at his son, feeling a wave of gratitude. There were still moments of tension between them, scars from the past that would take time to fully heal, but with each day, each completed project, each life touched, they were moving closer to reconciliation. "James," Edward began, hesitating, "I know I've said it before, but I'm sorry for everything." James sighed, taking a seat in the chair across from him. "Dad, we've already talked about this." I know, Edward said, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'll ever be able to make up for the past." James remained silent for a moment, his eyes roaming over the drawings on the walls. Finally, he spoke. "You know, Dad, when I planned that conspiracy, when I decided to seek revenge, I was certain it was the right thing to do. I thought that seeing you suffer would bring me some kind of peace." Edward felt a tightness in his chest, but he stayed silent, letting his son continue. "But then," James went on, "I saw how a simple drawing from a child did what years of anger and planning couldn't accomplish. I saw you change, not out of fear or manipulation, but by choice." He stood up, walking over to the wall of drawings. His fingers traced the colorful lines of one in particular, the drawing Miguel had given Edward in the hospital, depicting them all together. "This work we're doing, Dad," James said, turning back to face Edward, "it's not about making up for the past. It's about creating a better future. For us, for these kids, for everyone." Edward felt his eyes fill with tears. He stood up, joining James by the wall of drawings. "When I was young," Edward began, his voice low and reflective, "I dreamed of creating beautiful things, buildings that touched the sky, structures that defied imagination. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why it all became about numbers, power, control." James nodded in understanding. "And now," Edward smiled, picking up a drawing from the wall. It was one of the first Miguel had given him, showing a world full of color and happiness. "Now," Edward replied, "now I'm building something far more important. I'm building hope." Just then, the office door opened again. Sophia entered, followed by Miguel, now 8 years old, and Clara. "Sorry to interrupt," Sophia said, smiling, "but we have a surprise for you two." Miguel rushed forward, holding a large, rolled-up paper. "We made a new drawing," he announced proudly. "Everyone helped." With James's assistance, Miguel unrolled the paper, revealing an impressive collaborative work of art. It depicted the city, but not as Edward remembered it. His skyscrapers were still there, but they were surrounded by lush parks, welcoming hospitals and vibrant schools. And everywhere, there were people, figures of all ages, smiling and holding hands. At the center of the drawing was the Marx Foundation building, with Edward, James, Sophia, Miguel, and Clara standing in front, all smiling. Edward felt his throat tighten with emotion. It's beautiful," he managed to say. Clara stepped closer, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. "It's more than that," she said softly. "It's a vision of the future we're building together." Sophia nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "The children from the hospital helped draw the parks and schools. They're so excited about the new programs. And I drew us," Miguel interrupted happily, pointing to the central figures. James knelt beside Miguel, studying the drawing closely. "You captured my dad's bald head perfectly," he teased, prompting a laugh from Miguel and a playfully offended look from Edward. As they all admired the drawing, Edward felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He looked around at the people gathered, his son, with whom he was slowly rebuilding a relationship, Clara, who had found it in her heart to forgive him, Sophia, whose compassion had been a beacon of hope, and Miguel, whose simple act of kindness had sparked this entire transformation. "You know," Edward began, drawing everyone's attention, "a few months ago, when I was lying in that hospital bed, I couldn't imagine a future like this. I felt so lost, so empty." He paused, his eyes filling with tears once more. "But then, a little artist walked into my life with a colorful drawing and a limitless imagination. And everything changed." Miguel smiled shyly, clearly proud but a little embarrassed by the praise. "Miguel," Edward continued, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze, "you didn't just change my life. You gave me a second chance to do the right thing. To be the man, the father, the human being I should have been all along." He turned to Sophia. "And you, Sophia. Your compassion, your strength, you could have chosen the path of revenge, but you chose kindness. I'll never be able to thank you enough." Sophia smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Sometimes, Mr. Marx, the best revenge is forgiveness. Seeing the person who hurt you become better. There's no greater satisfaction." Edward nodded, then looked at James and Clara. "And the two of you, thank you for giving me a second chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I promise I'll do everything I can to be worthy of it." James, usually reserved with his emotions, stepped forward and embraced his father. "We're building something important here, Dad," he whispered. "Something that will last far longer than skyscrapers or fortunes." Clara joined the embrace, followed by Sophia and Miguel. For a moment, they stood together, united not just physically, but by a shared purpose, a vision of a better future. When they finally pulled apart, Edward picked up the new drawing, studying it once more. "You know what?" he said, smiling. "I think we've found the new logo for the Marx Foundation." Miguel's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Really? You're going to use our drawing?" Edward nodded, his heart swelling with joy at the boy's enthusiasm. "Absolutely. Because this is who we are now, builders of dreams, creators of hope." As the group began discussing where the drawing would be displayed and how to incorporate it into the foundation's work, Edward took a quiet moment to reflect. He looked out the window at the city he once saw only as a chessboard for his ambitions. Now he saw it differently, as a blank canvas ready to be filled with color, life, and endless possibilities. Edward Marx, the man once known as the shark of business, smiled to himself. His true legacy wouldn't be the buildings he'd constructed or the fortunes he'd amassed. It would be this, a world more colorful, more compassionate, inspired by a simple child's drawing and built with love, forgiveness, and hope. And as the sun set over the city, bathing the office in golden hues, Edward knew with certainty this was the masterpiece he was destined to create.